Hi, everybody. Good late afternoon, because it is late afternoon here in New Jersey. Welcome to Conversations with Calvin, We the Species. It is Wednesday, the 21st of July, just to put things in. I have been anticipating this time with Brian FINNEY, who the title of this interview is Brian FINNEY, Professor Emeritus of California State University, and an award prize-winning author of 9 books, of which a couple we're really going to plunge into. As I always so often say, Brian and I were connected by the universe, which consists of social media, and that's how we got put together, and not that long ago, and it was like an instant chemistry. I was so intrigued by Brian's background. We're going to kind of jump into that momentarily. And the fact that Brian and I are kind of contemporaries, I kind of relish that fact. Last week I'm interviewing a 22-year-old, and that's wonderful. But to have a contemporary, so Brian is such an interesting life. Why don't you take it away a little bit, and if you could do a little brief bio, which actually is kind of what I would want to touch on first. You're growing up. You're growing up in London, in England, during World War II. So take it away, Brian. Welcome.
Thank you, Calvin. Thank you for having me. Thank you for asking me. Yeah, I was actually born in London, and I was evacuated when the air raids started, like nearly every London kid.
Wow.
Yeah. And I was evacuated to a very unusual school, which was on the Welsh border and was run by this very advanced German Jewish educationist who had left Germany, in the mid-30s because of Hitler. And the majority of the children in the school were refugees from Germany or other parts of Europe who were Jews.
Wow.
So for them, the boarding school, which is what it was a home. I mean, they didn't go home during the vacations, although I did. I was part of a small English contingent that was there, if you like, to stop them doing what we did to the Japanese, which was to close the whole thing down and incarcerate them. And indeed, the school did stay open, and it was almost self-supporting. I mean, it grew nearly all of its own food, for example.
Wow.
So that was a very unusual early childhood, like elementary school. Then I went. My parents split up early on in my life, so I spent a lot of time in boarding schools, and I went to what the English call a grammar school.
I call that also grammar school.
Oh, you do? Okay. Well,
yes, I do.
Well, it went back to the English Civil War. And all the houses were split up into leaders for and against, the king or the parliament. And that was in Oxfordshire, just, a few, like less than 100 miles out of London. I do remember, though, going back to London for the vacations, and this was after the normal bombing had stopped. But when, towards the end of the European war, the Germans had developed what was called the V2 rocket, which they sent over in large numbers to London, which therefore meant that nearly every night I was woken up in a bad temper and carried down to the air raid shelter at the end of the garden.
Wow.
And those V2s, you could actually hear them stop. The engine would stop, and you then, I forget how many seconds you counted, something like 12 or 16 seconds before it dropped. So if you could actually hear it, you were still safe.
Oh.
If you didn't hear it, then bad luck. So that was an exceptional childhood in a way. But of course, we all thought of it as a big adventure. And a bombed out house was a wonderful playground for us to climb around in.
Wow.
And my father was what they called an air raid warden, who he had a bad chest and wasn't accepted into the forces. And so he had to spend his time on the roof watching the bombs come down and say, oh, there's a fire started, in such and such a house, which was a scary occupation night after night. He was an artist, full-time artist, which of course he wasn't. That wasn't earning him anything during the war. So that was childhood in London.
I can't even imagine. So you wound up going to school at London University, but
no, actually, I went to Reading University just for my first degree.
Okay. But I would love to ask you about, you are a veteran of the RAF.
Okay, well, when I finished, the English undergraduate degree takes 3 years. So when I had finished that and was 21 years old, I still was in that category where, we were subject to national service. They stopped national service almost the next year, but I was unfortunately early enough for that. So I decided, okay, if I've got to do this, then I'm going to do a 3-year officer commission. And I became an education officer in what we call Transport Command in an air station out in Oxfordshire again, where basically I spent a lot of my time teaching airmen either to qualify for promotion within the ranks, like from corporal to sergeant, or I spent a lot of time getting them qualified for university entrance because they were on national service as well, a lot of them.
Right.
And I enjoyed that, although I didn't like being in the hands of an authority that could do whatever it wanted with you. And I remember once the station commander nearly ran my wife off the road in his car when she was on a bicycle, and being unable to do anything about it because otherwise I might land up in some remote island in the Pacific Ocean or whatever, be posted there. At any rate, I found in the middle of those 3 years, we had the Suez Crisis. And the Suez Crisis meant
that was 57, right?
Yeah, exactly. We had, yeah, exactly. We had a lot of airmen who were about to take their qualifying exams of one sort or another, and who were whisked over to Cyprus because of the crisis. And that made me think, here I am, an education officer, which is not exactly this, I'm not a pilot or a navigator. And so I'm not going to do this again. I'm not going to go into the margin of the thing. I'm going to go straight into the center of it. And I chose to go into the car industry in England as what they called a graduate apprentice, where you went for a month to every single department or every single factory, and then you landed up as an internal consultant. So that actually lasted. I mean, I was in industry, first of all, in the car industry, and then I transferred and was given the post of production controller of a factory making quartz crystals for the equivalent of AT&T. And I was brought in because the sales department said, we can't get enough quartz crystals to satisfy our customers. And, there's an 8 or 10 week delay, from when we receive an order, etc. We need you to increase the production. So I did that. Within a year, I doubled the production.
Wow.
And as soon as my chart, reached up like that, the sales department turned around and said, whoa, I mean, we got it wrong. I'm sorry. We don't have that many customers. It was just a backlog. And I think you're going to have to return the production to what it was when you first came. So So I watched this chart, go up and then go down to where it started. And I thought, and and the car industry is exactly the same, boom, slump, boom, slump. I thought, do I really want to spend my entire life, producing more Zooms and the reverse? And I decided no. And so I applied for a position, what was an administrative position in London University, in the equivalent of what we would call the extension department.
Okay.
Where I would be hiring teachers and lecturers and practitioners from all of the arts, and make them available to the London public, mainly the adult public, mainly in the evenings or weekends. And that was a great job. It also allowed me to do some part-time teaching myself, but only a small amount. But it did enable me to employ, some of the best practitioners in England in their own particular specialities. I mean, I worked with the British Film Institute. I worked with the Institute of Contemporary Arts. I worked with the National Gallery and the Poetry Society and so on.
Oh.
So, it was very, it was wonderful to be able to just go wherever you wanted to and hire somebody and put them in front of the public. I did, well, what should I say? I went a stage too far with one incident. At the National Gallery, I would get the specialist of whatever the play was that was being produced new, and I would have them come and talk to the complete audience half an hour before the play, or an hour before the play. And I thought, this is ridiculous. It's the one audience gets to hear this guy, and that maybe there are what should we say 100 performances. So why don't we record it? And then it'll be available for them to see, again and again, each audience. So I had this Don, as they call them, from Oxford University, very well known, and also, married to a very well-known novelist, Iris Murdoch, and who had in his earlier times, had problems with stuttering. But I took references and they all said, no, I've never heard him stutter in the last few years, he's fine. So I had him there with a huge audience. The new play was Othello. And, we had the lights on him, and we had the mic in front of him, and we had the video camera in the central aisle. And he announced that his subject for that evening's talk was the difference in Othello between love and lust. From then onwards, it kept on coming back, of course, to those two terms, because that was what he was talking about. He stuttered every time he got to the L word.
Wow.
And the audience was extremely embarrassed and wrote furious letters to Sir Peter Hall, who's the director of the National Theatre. And that was the end of our experiment, videotaping these talks, which was a shame, because I think it would have been really, helpful for audiences.
Right.
We were going to play it so that while they were drinking their coffee or what have you before the play, they could actually see it on the video screen and listen to it. But,
interesting.
Yeah.
No, I just have to make one comment to the audience about the RAF, since I'm a little bit of a history buff, and you and I discussed this like last week when we chatted, but the respect that I have for the RAF and what they did, and of course, the famous quote, never have so few done so much for so many. But if you really do an intricate study of World War II and what could have been and what was, the RAF basically saved the war.
I agree. I mean, Britain would have been occupied without.
Oh yeah, and then what would we have done? Where would we have had a place to launch? So the RAF, simply that collection of fighters, just some of the most remarkable accomplishments in world history. That's my feeling. And actually a confession to you, if you'll take my confession, but when I was researching you to do this interview, I saw RAF and I said, done deal. I said, done deal. This is what a you know, I mean, yes, you weren't you weren't a pilot in World War II, but my goodness, to just have been in that special place. So
Okay, can I just say that, you know, in wartime, so to speak, my job was intelligence officer. I had to break codes and, you know,
wow,
send signals, etc.
wow.
So,
So all this background, and then you with your schooling, you do a research trip to California, and that you were researching D.H. Lawrence, and doing a biography of Christopher Isherwood, and you wound up interviewing Laura Huxley, who I just asked you before we went on air. Is she related to Aldous Huxley, which you told me she was a second wife, and I think once a day I quote Aldous Huxley. Yes, I do. It's a brave new world.
yeah,
and so can you talk about that first trip to California?
sure. The first trip was back in like 1971, and was for the PhD on Lawrence. And I actually split it. In 1970, I did all the Eastern universities, and then in 1971, I did Austin, Texas, and you know, both UCLA and Berkeley. And what I was doing was I was looking primarily at the original manuscripts that Lawrence either wrote or had typed, and then wrote, you know, wrote corrections on, etc. And I mean, this was well worth doing because, you know, I would find, for example, that the printer had skipped over 2 pages of something he'd written in a notebook, and that every edition of Lawrence had missed out those 2 pages that should be there and were his, and I got them restored, of course. Or I found a story that his publisher couldn't find the second half of. They lost the second half, so he rewrote it much later on with a second half that didn't belong to the first. I mean, he was a different guy by then, and thematically it broke in half. And again, I was able in I think it was Yale to find the original early half. So that was, I mean, that was a very, you know, at that time nobody had done work on the short stories of Lawrence, and so it was a very rewarding, you know, thing to do. In fact, in UCLA, which was I discovered the what was it now? It was the manuscript of one of his later novellas called The Man Who Died, which was a retelling of the life of Christ, where he actually, after the crucifixion, had recovered in some country, what should I say, courtyard, looked after by the farmers, and eventually issued back out as an ordinary man, swearing never to sacrifice his life again. And the American public, when that first version was published, some of the public was extremely outraged, of course, you know, at that. And so he wrote a second part of it, in which Jesus meets up with the priestess of Isis in Israel. Well, it wasn't Israel then, in Palestine. And they finally have sex together, at which point the Romans are pursuing them, and they both go back into other directions. In other words, it was just the second year cycle. It was a cycle of life and death, life and death. You know, that's what Lawrence was really trying to.
Right.
I had to, UCLA would not allow me to photocopy or this. I had to read it into a tape recorder in the research room.
Wow.
And all the graduates who were, you know, ostensibly pursuing their studies dropped what they were doing and listened to every word of the story as I was doing this, even though I was trying to, you know, dictate it quietly. Of course, it had its embarrassing moments, but I kept going. But that was my first introduction to LA. Then I had then I decided to write the biography of Christopher Isherwood, which itself finally actually won a national prize in England. And Isherwood, by this stage, I mean, he was a very famous writer of the 30s in England. He set a whole style. Of course, he was gay. He was a great friend of W.H. Auden. The two of them, just before the war broke out, immigrated to New York. Auden loved New York. Isherwood hated it, and he settled in Santa Monica in California, which is, right part of Los Angeles, on the coast here. So I came out here to interview him and to interview all his friends in order to write the biography. And to do that, I actually got the chairman of the English department of the UCLA to give me a couple of summer courses, one for graduates, one for undergraduates. And he was gay too, so he was all for getting the biography.
Sure.
And I interviewed a whole range of different people who knew him, of course. One of them was, he was very friendly with Aldous Huxley, but Huxley, of course, was dead by then. And so I interviewed Laura Huxley. She lived up in Santa Monica Mountains somewhere, I can't remember quite where. And at the end of the interview, after I finished, she was known as a psychic, but I'm a great rationalist and skeptic. And she turned around to me and she said, you're going to come back here. I said, oh yes. She said, yeah, no, I mean, you're going to come back here to stay.
Wow.
So I said, oh really? No, this was back in the later 70s. And I went away thinking, oh, these psychics,
Wow.
And in 1987, I came out here permanently, and I've lived in LA ever since. So she couldn't have been more right.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
So that, I guess that changed a little bit of your skepticism about psychics. Wow. Isn't that interesting?
Mm-hmm.
Not now. Someday we can talk about that kind of stuff, because I've lived it. I've seen it. And it's quite an unusual talent. I don't have it, but some friends of mine do. But anyway, so you're in you're in LA and you begin teaching. So you taught at several California universities. Can you just talk about that a little bit?
Sure. I mean, what made me eventually, come out here was that I'd become a sort of chair in the department in London by this stage. And this was during the Maggie Thatcher years, and Thatcher was making severe cuts of adult education, including university adult education. And I was having to execute them. I mean, I'd get a smaller budget and I had to make it work somehow. And I thought, why am I doing this? I went over in the summer to UCLA or to USC another summer, and it was really enjoyable because all I did was teach. And all I had to do was interact with students. So I thought, I'm going to do that. So I went and interviewed for jobs in New York, got nowhere, and thought, to hell with it, I'm just going. And meantime, I'd also met, the first time I came over in 1986, a year before I immigrated, I met Jackie, my wife. So there was a further very personal incentive going there.
Sure.
And, or my wife to be at any rate. And at any rate, I reached the point where the day before I was flying out, everything was packed up in my apartment. The phone was about to be disconnected, and it went. And I picked it up, and this woman's voice said, "This is the chair of UC Riverside, and we interviewed you in New York, and you were our second choice. And the first choice, it turns out, has already signed a contract with another university. So would you like a visiting professorship?"
Wow.
I said, well, of course I would.
Wow.
And she said, well, in that case, you've actually been paid since the beginning of this month. So I landed very, very easily. And that visiting professorship lasted for 2 years. And I would say that the only minor disadvantage was Riverside is like, at that time, was about just under 2 hours commute drive from Venice in California, where I live on the coast here. But otherwise, it was a great job. And after that, I suddenly got thrown on the market and learnt the true meaning of Freeway Flyer, because one semester, for example, I remember I was teaching at University of Southern California, UCLA, and California State University, Long Beach. And my wife would say to me, "Are you sure you got the right notes? Do you remember? Are you going to the right location?" You know, because you know what vague professors are like. But anyway, I survived that. And eventually I decided that whereas USC and UCLA were, you know, both gave me big classes of maybe 100 students where I would lecture, and then the graduate students would have seminars with the undergraduates, which I think is the more, you know, fun bit of it, because you're actually interacting with them.
Right.
In the Cal State system, the classes are, you know, roughly speaking 30, or in the graduate side, you know, like 12 or so, 15. And I much preferred having small classes to teach, because I could get to know the students by name and so on. So I eventually settled for California State University, and finally the chair there did some kind of magical trickery that persuaded the administration very late on to take me on to a tenured appointment. And I claim, I'm sure I'm right, I must have been the oldest assistant professor in the entire States. But I managed to quickly get promoted, you know, to associate and then full professor within 5 years or so. And meantime, at least, you know, you weren't suffering from a pay point of view. I mean, they took what I was being paid from Riverside as a sort of marker. So I wasn't being paid like most assistant professors. So that, I mean, that finally worked out. It was a lot of work. And, you know, when you're a lecturer, when you're, you know, adjunct, you don't get to know what you're teaching, what courses you're teaching, until maybe the week or even days before the beginning of the semester. So, you know,
Wow.
that's pretty tough too. Yeah.
Wow. I have just a minute amount of identification, because I did teach at Rutgers a couple years ago, a course in career explorations, and I think I mentioned to you that for me, that was what you do. It to me is one of the most marvelous undertakings to mold and to teach young people, and for me to have been offered to teach at Rutgers, my alma mater, with no teaching background whatsoever, no credentials whatsoever, was it's kind of a paraphrase of Martin Luther King. You know, I've been to the mountaintop, and that's why I so admire, and I was so thrilled to be able to sit down with you and chat, because I have such great admiration and respect for teaching, and I did it myself for a little bit, and I climbed the mountaintop. I was on the mountaintop and I taught students. So anyway,
you know, probably you were a better teacher for not, you know, being the sort of additional qualified one, because you were closer to how the students felt and how they learned and so on. And that probably meant,
you know, they gave me all A's and B's. I was kind of, you know, they grade you at Rutgers so that the students grade the teachers, and listen, I was a nervous guy of every class. I mean, I was nervous because I wanted to do well. I knew what I was talking about, but when, you know, the semester was over and they graded me, I got all A's and B's. I said, oh wow, I never got grades like that when I was a student. So it was, but that's my the energy with which I reached out to you because of your teaching experience. So we've established, you know, you're Professor Emeritus at the Cal State. But let's talk about, and you wrote prior 7 nonfiction, and then you delved into this new world of fiction writing, and your first book, which didn't come out too long ago, is called Money Matters, which is it's right there behind you. So that's and that was a finalist for the American Fiction Award.
Yes, it was. Yeah.
Which I think is extraordinary, to go from nonfiction all those years and then to so what is Money Matters about? What was the process? How did that all come about?
I mean, I stopped full-time teaching, and I thought, finally I have the freedom I've been wanting all my life. I can choose to do whatever I want. And I thought, I'm not going to produce another academic book, which is what I'd done, for the previous few books. What do I really want to do? And before I knew where I was, I found myself writing the outline for a novel. And once I started writing the novel itself, I found that I had got the voice of my narrator major character, who was totally different from me. I mean, she was a 27-year-old American woman, so you couldn't be much further away than what I was. But once I got into her voice, I found the novel just writing itself. It was sort of pouring out of me. And of course, I knew where I was going from the outline, but nevertheless, the outline always takes second place to what the character demands you once you start writing. So it's really hard to say that I had a very specific motive, although I do find that I can't just write about individuals. They have to be set within a social and political context for me to feel it's significant. And she gets very much involved in the immigration issues and the immigration debate that was going on in 2010, which is when the novel is set, during the midterm election, when Jerry Brown was running against Meg Whitman as governor of California, and Meg Whitman was running on an anti-immigration platform, and then she was found to be employing an illegal immigrant, so to speak, somebody who didn't have papers. I mean, at any rate, she lost badly, but that was certainly one of the major issues in the entire campaign. So that, if you like, enabled me to feel that what I was writing about in these invented characters was also, they weren't that invented. They were within a real social and political context, even though they were imagined themselves. And that therefore readers could relate to the whole situation more readily. We talk about immigration, of course, in abstract ways of one sort or another, but to actually live the life of somebody who is an immigrant, and she wasn't an immigrant, but I have a subplot in which there is an immigrant. He was like a Ducker kid, except he wasn't Ducker. And halfway through the book, he gets caught and arbitrarily thrown across the border to Mexico, which he didn't even speak Spanish. And he lands up with his grandfather, not able to communicate with him. So then it comes home. That's the difference. And that's why I felt that writing a novel was actually more real, if you like. It would affect people more than just talking about it in the abstract in a non-fiction manner.
Well, I can loosely identify with that. I wrote my first novel 12 years ago. I think I mentioned that to you, and now I'm literally a couple of weeks away from finishing my second novel.
Well, congratulations, Calvin.
Yes.
You know that.
Yes, literally a matter of weeks. I've been really negligent because I've been doing this, and I spent a couple of years really plunging into it, and then the pandemic set in, and I discovered this channel, Conversation with Calvin, and that's taken all my energies. And a month ago, I said, this is ridiculous. I got a couple more chapters, so I plunged into that. So, and I also, and this is a good segue, I plunged And I'm not laying any guilt on you, Brian, but you've taken me away. You've taken me away from finishing my novel because I started reading your second novel.
I'm sorry.
No, it's all right. No, I mean, so we're going to talk about this. And I said this before we went on air. I am not a literary critic, but I'm almost half done with this. I only got it a couple days. And I said this to you. What it made me think of watching a really good mystery movie, and the music background, and that's artistry in itself, keeping you at the edge of your seat. And the way you write is like music in the background. For me, I'm just waiting and anticipating, and it is so contemporary because you're talking about the pandemic and you're talking about QAnon. And so I'm just saying, for the folks out there, this is quite an enjoyable, I can't wait to finish kind of a read. So how did this come about? And there's a lot of Hamlet in here, which, yes, you're laughing. So how did this come about, Dangerous Conjectures?
Well, it was partly my own reaction to what was going on politically, which was one of, like many liberals, was one of outrage. And we're only beginning to see some of the criminality that was going on now. And it was also disbelief. I mean, I still, as I said, I am naturally a skeptic. I'm less of a skeptic after Laura Huxley than I was, but I've still got that thing in me. And I couldn't believe that the QAnon conspiracy was getting so much traction. And indeed, when I started with this book, I would talk to friends and say, well, part of what the book is about is the prevalence, the spread of conspiracy theories in America at this time. And they would say, well, what do you mean? I'd say, well, look, take QAnon. They'd say, QAnon, what's that? And at the beginning of 2020, hardly anybody except the QAnon, followers knew anything about it. And that was the only bit of prescience, if you like, that was there. At any rate, my skeptical self felt, what is it that captures the followers of QAnon and that it makes it into a growing phenomenon? And so I came up with one of the two major characters, Adam, who, like me, is a professor, but unlike me, he teaches at Berkeley in 2020 as a computer scientist. And so, as a computer scientist, he's absolutely appalled at anything that's not fact-based. As a scientist, he thinks everything ought to be, evidence-based. But he has a wife who works for the ACLU in San Francisco, who, right at the beginning of the spread of the pandemic, before it even hit the United States, gets really scared of it. I mean, she's in fear for life. She never thought about her life as, having a possible ending. She's in her 30s. And suddenly she sees death waiting for her outside the front door, so to speak. And that causes her to make some very bad decisions of one sort or another. The least of which is, what should I say, encouraging, accepting, if you like, some conspiracy theories that her best friend keeps on passing to her, like, 5G towers,
Yeah, I read that. I read that. I just can't. I mean, I can't process that. How?
I know, but it had a big following. I mean,
yeah,
this is.
I just can't. I mean, this is just absolutely what a great read. And I'm not saying that I don't have to say it, but and actually for me to have gone this far so quickly is testament to the storytelling. And actually, and I'll bang this out and then I'll get back to you to tell you when I finish. but it's truly great. So, and it's so contemporary. I mean, it's like
It is still
yesterday.
relevant. I mean, the issues are still relevant.
Yeah, it's so it's so it's so required to really read about this and get a better understanding. I think, by the way, I mean, I think there's just massive amounts of people who don't really understand conspiracy theories because they don't have it, but they don't understand
Mhm.
just how prevalent,
Right.
that is, and how inculcated that is. I looked that word up before we went on air.
Inculcated.
Yes, it's a good word.
Yeah.
So inculcated it is, but I'm totally enjoying this. So two more questions as we wind down. Oh, by the way, I do have a I do have a Calvin question to ask you. I like to ask this at times, and I think this is a good time. Excluding family or friends, Brian, don't be scared. Excluding family or friends, somebody living or dead you would like to spend the day with.
I, well, there are several actually.
Well,
And
you
I
can
mean,
say several. There's no rules.
I mean, I would love to have spent a day with Shakespeare because I think he wasn't just a great writer, he was a great liver. He obviously had a fantastic time there in the London theatre world and mixing with, the palace and so on. And otherwise, well, I wrote a book on Beckett, and I once got to actually spend a day with Beckett in Paris, not a day, an hour in his favorite cafe. I'd love to spend a day with him because I think he is, such an original thinker and such a realist in a way. So I think that would be my second choice. Maybe my third would be D.H. Lawrence, who I've always admired for being way ahead of his time in terms of the environment, in terms of, what should I say, the overemphasis on the intellectual and the will, as opposed to emotional feelings that, inspired all his books, really. That would be it.
That's great. And this is totally irrelevant and random, but I went to the same high school as Philip Roth.
I love his writing. In fact, I'm reading one of his books at the moment.
Same high school. He's actually we grew up in the same section in Newark, and just about every novel goes back to the Weequahic section in Newark. And there are characters I know because he was 6, 7, 8 years older than me, so I never was in high school at the same time.
Right.
But, I know of the energies where he derives so many of his stories. And it's funny talking to you, now as you're a writer and a professor. And if I could be a type of writer, it would be like Philip Roth, but that's just a dream. So
for me too. I mean, I think he's a great writer.
Yeah, just beyond. And it's funny. I watched a documentary on Philip Roth. He did a lot of writing standing up. Did you know that?
Yes, I did. Yeah.
He actually stood up at a table and wrote.
He also had back problems, if I remember rightly. But he did. Yeah, he did. He did. Most of the time he wrote standing up.
Yeah, I'm amazed about that, and I get a kick out of. I just got a kick out of him because that section of Newark that he writes about so often. He brings it up. The Plot Against America was Newark. I mean, it's all Newark. But I just thought I'd share that with you.
No, we share the
Yes.
same.
So a couple, just to wind down, two things, two more little questions. Completely in a different direction. How do you like living in Venice Beach?
I mean, I've been. I when I first came in 1987, that's where I settled. Is that
a culture shock to you? That kind of a place?
Well, definitely, yeah. But at the same time, a nice culture shock.
Sure.
And in a way, I mean, you know, it's so different from traditional American suburbia. You know, at that time, it was filled with, you know, on the one hand, bohemians, one sort or another. On the other hand, artists of one kind or another. A big artist community. It still does have a small artist community left. And of course, it's, you know, the surfing capital of the world. I mean, I look out, I'm having breakfast and looking through the window. There are these guys, you know, going down, irrespective of the weather, you know, with their surfboards on their heads.
Well,
it's great. It's a great community, really great. It has been, you know, over the last quarter century or so, to some extent invaded by and partially taken over by, you know, rich tech workers.
mm-hmm.
And therefore the price of the housing has gone, you know.
Sure. That's what usually happens.
Yeah.
Finally, Brian, future think. Plans for the future?
All right. To tell the truth, at the moment, I got the equivalent of writer's block, but it isn't writing that I'm blocked with.
Okay.
It's translating the idea I had into, you know, a dramatic, realizable, concrete object. I would like to write, in some way or another, write a novel that reflected the growing disparity of wealth between the very rich and the very poor, which is quite, I mean, you know, we've just seen a couple of billionaires go and fly themselves into outer space.
That's right.
Horrible waste of money as far as I'm concerned.
No kidding. No kidding.
So, but I cannot yet, you know, I started off with the idea of maybe a homeless woman, you know, parking her van outside a billionaire's residence and him trying to get rid of her and failing, and then eventually having to let her in because the van goes up in flames or something. And then slowly the two of them actually, you know, meeting, understanding what it is that's so different about the other. But they haven't become real for me yet.
Okay. Okay. By the way, so intriguing. I'm not going to steal your idea, but so intriguing. You know that there's so much to be said about that topic. I used to quote that the 88 richest people in the world have more wealth than the poorest 3.5 billion.
It's a shocking statistic.
And you know, you got to process that. And I'm an environmentalist, and if we, you know, the fires that are out there, are all over the West.
You're even suffering from the smoke on the East Coast.
We are, and by the way, there's all kinds of health alerts.
Yes, I heard.
So bad here, 3,000 miles away.
Yeah.
So, but that's just one small thing, and then, you know, the Great Salt Lake, which has been around a million years, is at its lowest level in 100 years, and half of it is dust.
Like a disaster movie.
And then Saturday, I interview an Amazon. He lives right near the Amazon. He's a environmentalist, and actually, he's from England.
Really?
Yes, he's a countryman, and we met here, and he graduated from college in England, and they did a 3-week trip to the Amazon rainforest, and he stayed for 30 years. So his thing is trying to, but anyway, I'm going off topic. But that's an interesting premise that you have, and do develop it. So we've now we're kind of winding down. This time with you has been it's really been very special, precious to me, for a whole bunch of different reasons. The channel is always open to you to come back and chat, because this channel is evolving, and I would love that. And I just want to thank you so much for your graciousness and your time. And also, thank you for this.
Well, I'd like to thank you, Calvin,
Yeah.
for giving me the opportunity to share.
Yes. So again, Brian, I thank you so much, and I wish you only good things. And please do come back.